This has to do with Key Strategy 1.3, one of the bullets under there, supporting the improvement of education outcomes for First Nation students in Alberta. And on page 52 to 54 of the government business plan, it shows that the government has set targets for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students' achievement at 5 to 20% lower than for non-FNMI students. As an example, 84.5% of non-FNMI students are expected to achieve an acceptable standard on science diploma exams, but the government's only expecting 77% of FNMI students to achieve that standard. So how do we reconcile these two things, supporting the improvement of education outcomes, but the expectation seems to be pretty low?
Yeah, there's always that concern that if you set an expectation lower than it would be for any other community, that you're short-selling. And I know that's a serious concern. But the reality is that we have a devastating history with First Nations people in this province, and we have done a lot to ensure that they are not successful in terms of the type of education that's been provided, the funding of the teachers, the building of the schools, and so on. And as a result, we have a long way to go. Now, it would be noble for us to say by the end of this year, First Nations people will graduate at the same rate or be successful on exams, as you mentioned, the same rate as non-Indigenous people in this province. But it would be completely unrealistic because we are coming from too far behind. So each year they make a decision about what's the next best thing we can do, what's the next incremental improvement that we can achieve. And I would anticipate that, and I'm speaking for another ministry, so I can only anticipate, I can't tell you, that they would keep raising that bar up until the ultimate goal, which we have declared is that there be no difference at all on all measures of well-being for Indigenous people as compared to non-Indigenous people. And so I encourage you to go to the Minister of Education in this particular case and ask them about their plans to make sure that First Nations people are successful in communities. I know we've been putting lots of pressure on the federal government to start increasing the amount of money they're putting into schools, because right now they only give about 70% of what we give per student basis to the schools. They pay their teachers less, and as a result, they tend to get teachers who, don't have a lot of experience, but they're happy to get a first job. But then as soon as they get some experience, they leave and come back into, major centers, that kind of thing. And we really think they need to fund at the same level as this province. And I would love it if all of our parties could get together and say to them, that's the standard. Whatever the province funds, that's what the Fed should fund, not some national average, which is essentially what they use right now.
There is a school that, I'm sorry, I can't tell you what the name of it is right now, but I was reading about it last week, where it's in the southern part of the U.S., it's in Louisiana, and a lot of African-American students, and they have such a high rate of their students going on to universities and being accepted into colleges like Harvard and Yale and other Ivy League schools. And I would really love to see that we have that kind of a stand for our students from Indigenous communities, that we're a stand that they go to university, not simply that they maintain or they achieve the same as everybody else.
Your point is well taken. I absolutely 100% support that. We are not trying to find some low standard to meet here. We are trying to find a standard that will be moving on and getting us to the successful place. But I can also tell you, I went to the University of Alberta's Round Dance a couple of months ago, and I asked them, so what's the number of people that belong to the Indigenous community at the University of Alberta? And they told me 2,500 people. And I can tell you that when I go around and talk to the communities, education is one of their highest priorities. And we are working very hard to make sure it's not just finish grade 10 or grade 11 or grade 12, but to get good enough marks to go to university, be successful in university. And we put lots of supports into universities to get people there in the first place, and then secondly, to ensure that they get the supports they need. And we're seeing some great success now. I like to say to people, I know more people with more Indigenous people with PhDs than you probably know people with PhDs. and that's a great sign of success and why we support, Indigenous education in this province.
Thank you for that. This has back again to do with outcome 1.4, which is on page 90, supporting the First Nations and Métis Women's Councils on economic security. So it appears from the indigenous.alberta.ca website that the report only comes out every 2 years. Would that be accurate? Or can you get back to me about that?
Yeah, I'll have to get back
Okay.
because that's not my understanding. It would typically come out every year.
Do you understand
Okay, we'll get back to you about
in the
it,
budget
'cause we're out of time.
what part of the budget supports implementation of the accepted but outstanding recommendations from these reports? And is that information public, or will it be made public?
Well, I just want to remind you again that we have a facilitative role. So you don't just look at the budget within Indigenous relations. If they make a recommendation that's about justice, then what you should see is that we go to justice and we say, this is a really great recommendation. You need to do something about this. And you should see in the justice budget that they put money into those things to enhance the well-being of Indigenous people in the province.
But I think during the budget process that it's really important for everybody to be able to understand where those specific expenses are, so that we can correlate what you're doing with what the spend is, and be able to understand, are we getting a return on that budget line item? Is it coming up with the kind of result that the expectation was in the beginning?
Yeah.
I apologize for the interruption, but I must advise that the committee that the time allotted for the item of business has concluded.